There is no doubt that this is the best time in history to learn a language, especially English. We are surrounded by a world of English content. English language learning apps, English courses, English teachers, information. But one important question still remains. What do we do with all this information? How do we study? How do we learn a language? One man who knows the answer to this question is Paul Nation. He has been studying language acquisition and language teaching methodology for more than 50 years. In this interview, he talks about the 4 strands. And by following this simple concept, both teachers and students can find success at teaching and learning a language. This is an edited version of our interview. If you would like to listen to the full version, you will find a link down in the description box below, where you will also find a link to Paul's website. I hope that you enjoy this interview. Mr. Paul Nation, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I think that in the world of, language learning and vocabulary learning, you're definitely considered one of the experts in the field. And I know that you've developed these, not just in vocabulary learning, but in language learning in general, you've developed these 4 strands, which are meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, language-focused learning, and fluency development. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about exactly what each one of those strands are.
Well, the reason that I ended up with something like the 4 strands is that I'd read a lot of research, but I was having trouble connecting it to each other. So, you'd read one piece of research about writing and how, what was important for writing, and then you'd read another piece of research, something to do with speaking, and you'd sort of see, well, and then about research about deliberate learning and so on. So I thought we need some sort of framework to sort of connect these to each other. And so I eventually came up with the idea of the 4 strands, and it's not a very profound idea, but it actually has some really profound implications, I think. And the problem is that there is no research there's no research which actually supports the idea of the 4 strands as 4 strands. And I don't really see how you could sensibly do research which would support the idea, but there is evidence for each one of the strands. So there's very strong evidence, for example, that there should be learning through comprehensible input. And Steve Krashen has been one of the people who has really advocated this very strongly indeed. But there's also evidence that it's really important to learn through output as well, and that input by itself is not enough. There's also very strong evidence for deliberate learning, and that is, doing study of language features, particularly for vocabulary. And there's plenty of evidence for the importance of fluency development and how, you can know the language and yet not be able to use what you know. And so it's important to be able to make the best use of what you already know. And so I just put these together into the 4 strands. The implications which come from the 4 strands, I think, are important. And the implication is that 3/4 of your time, that is meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, and fluency development, should be spent actually using the language. Because those 3 strands of input, output, and fluency development all require a focus on communication and a focus on the message. So if we regard reading as communication and writing to someone to tell them something as communication, or even writing an article, to get to communicate ideas to people. If we see all of those as communication, then 3/4 of the time in a language course should be spent actually using the language.
I suspect, and from my personal experience, I think that that is not how a majority of language classrooms are kind of set up. And I think that probably a lot of learners would be very surprised to hear that something like kind of sitting down with a book and memorizing stuff would be something that you would only spend maybe 25% of your time doing rather than 90%. So I'm sort of wondering how you feel about kind of the state of the industry at the moment.
Yeah, well, I think there's just far too much teaching going on. Um, this isn't a new view. I mean, I've looked back at the writings of Michael West, for example, who's one of my heroes in the field of vocabulary studies. And well over, let me think now, it's probably 80 years ago, West was saying things like, there is too much teaching going on in classrooms and not enough learning going on. And so it's by no means a new idea. And the problem is that teachers believe, I think, that learning comes from teaching. And if you take a fairly narrow view of teaching to include part of what is language focused learning, then of course, yes, there is far too much teaching going on because, as you say, 80–90% of the time that learners spend in language courses seem to be on language focused learning. So it's really important to realize that things like extensive reading are actually major contribute or can be major contributors to learning. Now, one of my colleagues who I respect very much, Bharti Laufer, argues that in language, extensive reading is important, but in language courses, most people learn vocabulary through deliberate study. And she's right, but it shouldn't be like that. People should be spending, 3/4 of the time actually learning vocabulary through reading, learning vocabulary through listening, putting vocabulary into use through speaking and writing, and about 1/4 of the time actually studying vocabulary or being taught vocabulary. So I think that's one of the more profound implications of the 4 strands, and that is we have to see deliberate learning as playing a relatively small but important part. And in that strand of deliberate learning, teaching is only a part of that strand. So it's really less than 1/8 of a course.
I know a majority of EFL classrooms are sort of centered around the workbook, but it seems that a lot of your work shows that workbooks are not really where the learning happens.
Well, I've just been working on workbooks actually. I've been trying. I my favorite book that I've written is a book called "What Should Every EFL Teacher Know?" And I thought because I'd read about 2 or 3 other people's attempts to write a similar kind of book, and I looked at those attempts and thought, hell, I can do better than that. And then and then I thought, I've been working in this field for 50 years. If I can't just sit down and say what I think is important for someone, you know, for for a teacher to know and for a teacher to do, then I've been wasting my time. So I wrote that book probably within a couple of weeks because it didn't require lots of research. It required lots of drawing on research I'd already read and experience and things like that. And it's actually the book I felt most satisfied with after writing it. And I've been recently working on a simpler version of that book. That book is very simple and straightforward, and it's written within roughly a 3 to 4,000 word vocabulary. But I'm writing a book for teachers who have very little training and who teach in circumstances where they have to use a course book and so on. And so by looking at that and applying the idea of the 4 strands, I sort of came to the conclusion that at the very most, a, a course book can provide about half of the material that you need for a well-balanced language course. Because you can't include extensive reading within a course book because extensive reading involves each person reading at their own level and reading very large quantities of material, not a few thousand words, but hundreds of thousands of running words. And you just can't put all that in the course book. And even if you could, you wouldn't be at the right level for some of the students in the course, in the class, because every class has a range of proficiencies. And it's the same with extensive listening. You can't include all of that. And then, you could include a reading fluency course, I suppose, within a course book. But even then, you're looking at quite a substantial addition to the course book. So course books can't cover everything. And I reckon at the best, if you've got the best designed course book, you're lucky to cover half of what needs to be covered in terms of opportunities for learning.
I think this links back to your kind of original, the thing you were talking about before, that there's too much teaching going on. Like, because I know that you sort of see the role of the teacher not as a person who kind of delivers knowledge, but more, as an abstract sort of, an abstract figure in the classroom who is there to motivate and guide, and maybe not to do so many explicit things. Is that a fair summary of your ideas, or not really?
I tried to list, and whenever I make a list, I like to rank the list, because there's not much point in making a list unless you signal what's important in it and so on. And I put the teacher's number one job as a planner. And the two major ways of planning, which I looked at, but there are probably other ways, is first of all to make sure that there's a balance of opportunities across the four strands. And then the second aspect of planning is to make sure that you're focusing on material which is appropriate to the student. That is, you're not teaching really low frequency vocabulary, but you're teaching vocabulary which is the next most important level of vocab for learners to learn. And the same with grammar features and so on. The second job of the teacher is probably to organize, and that is to get the classroom working, to organize extensive reading, to organize conversation activities, to organize extensive listening, and to set up procedures and things like that so the learners can get on and do the work. And the third job of the teacher is to train, and that is to train the learners in taking some responsibility for their own learning and to learn strategies which really help them to become independent from teachers. And I sort of, at times I want to raise the ranking of the training one, because I think a very important job of teachers is to train. And in real life, I've come across a few examples which have been quite striking for me about the effect of training people how to learn. I've got a sore knee. Well, it's not that sore, but my knee is a bit weak. So I went to see a physiotherapist. And the physiotherapist turned out to be a friend of one of my relatives, but that's neither here nor there. And he was telling me how he became a physiotherapist. When he was working in the post office, a sort of telecom thing, with my nephew, actually. This is the relative. And while they were there, they had to go on training courses. And he went on a training course. And on one of the training courses, they gave him some hints about how to go about learning the material related to his job. And he sort of took these points and applied them and found, wow, when I was at secondary school, I thought I was dumb because I wasn't doing well at school at all. And now that someone showed me how to do these things, I find that I can do them quite easily. Now, the things that he was told were actually not that great. I mean, there's much better advice that could have been given, but he was told things like, get the important points, write them on post-it notes, stick them on your refrigerator, stick them on the wall and things like that, you know. Now, there's much better training that you can do, like teaching people the importance of retrieval, for example, and the importance of spaced repetition, the importance of spaced retrieval, the importance of quality of mental processing. You know, these things are very well proven ways. But what he did was then when he realized that he was good at, you know, he wasn't dumb, he was good at learning. He then said, well, I always wanted to be a physiotherapist. So then he enrolled at university for a course in physiotherapy. And now he's a really highly regarded physiotherapist doing the job he loves. And in a way, that's traceable back to a teacher who said, I'm not here just to teach the things. I'm here also to show you how you can learn and go about learning. So you know, I'm a great espouser of, you know, the autonomy movement. I just think that, you know, people are really primarily responsible for their own learning, but teachers have a responsibility to show them how to do this well, you know, and it's important then that part of a teacher's job is not only saying here's what you need to know, but here's how you can know it, and here's how research shows you can know these things and learn them well, you know. And now I've forgotten the fourth and fifth jobs of the teacher now, but there's something like to test. Oh yes, that's right. To test learners so that you can find out where they are. They can find out where they are in their learning, and the teacher can see if they're making progress. And the fifth job is to actually teach. And teaching's important, but it's at the bottom of the list, you know.
Well, actually, this was actually yeah, a piece of research which really surprised me of yours from 2000 with you and Marcella Hu, and yeah, and you, I don't know if you were the first to discover it, but you proved that you need to know 98% of vocabulary in a text for you to have unassisted comprehension. I mean, that blows my mind. My instinct would have told me that, you know, maybe like 75% or something.
I wasn't the first to discover that. You can go back to Michael West. And Michael West, in his writings, say one unknown word in every 50. He wasn't doing it from research. He was doing it from being a teacher who was writing material for students to read, and that's what he came to. The research shows that the higher the coverage, the greater the comprehension will be. So you can still comprehend a text with, say, certainly with 95%, but the comprehension isn't as great as you'd probably like it to be. And you can get some degree of comprehension with 90%, but it's still, you know, you're getting further away from having good comprehension. So there's been later research on that. It's you don't want to take it too, how would you say? I was going to say too seriously. You probably should take it a little bit seriously, but 98% is, you know, a fairly precise sort of figure. And the rule of thumb that people apply with extensive reading is you should pick up a book, have a look, and if there are, you know, a lot of unknown words on the first page or the second page, you've probably got a book which is too difficult for you. And if there's only a few unknown words, then you probably got a book at the right level and things like that, you know. So you can try and get precise about it, and research can give you some support on that. But in practice, it's quite good to just say, look, if you're overburdened with unknown words, you're reading the wrong book.
I know that you know, the next part of the kind of strand is meaning-based output. And what's interesting, I think, is that a lot of the systems out there, you know, systems and methods and also, interestingly, even polyglots that I've spoken to, they're really always telling me that, you know, input is the thing. It's like reading, listening, input, and so for me, it's kind of refreshing to see, you know, a real focus put on output.
Yeah, well, it's common sense, really, because you're not going to be a good speaker unless you do some speaking. You're not going to be a good writer unless you do some writing, you know. So there's a one of the principles that I think is a quite an important one, but a very crude one, is what's called the time on task principle. And that is, if you want to be good at something, do it a lot. And it's a fairly crude quantity-based principle, but it almost always works. And so that means if you want to be good at reading, do lots of reading. And you'll get really good at reading, you know, and particularly if you're getting comprehensible input and gradually, you know, keeping to your I+1 as you move up the levels and so on. But if you want to get good at speaking, you're not going to, you know, you're not going to get there by just doing lots of reading. It's going to help, but it's not going to take you that, you know, to become a good speaker. You got to speak. And so in a way, then, you know, that's the sort of common sense argument. There's also some research support for the comprehensible output idea, but it's probably not as strong as the input research. Yeah. I've just finished a book with Rob Waring on extensive reading, where we reviewed much of the research. There is quite a lot of research, and we tried to pick out what was the very best research and so on. But the research evidence for comprehensible input is very strong evidence. But it's as you mentioned earlier, it's really to get teachers accepting the idea that it's okay for learners to sit down and spend almost, say, close to a quarter of their learning time in and out of the classroom just sitting down quietly reading. That's a hard thing for teachers to accept. And they think, but I should be teaching, you know, how can they learn if I'm not teaching? And how can we be sure that they're really reading and you know, they're really learning and so on? And it's a brave teacher who lets that happen. But the research shows that it does happen. But it's difficult.
I wanted to ask you about, well, I wanted to actually read to you a little bit from the PDF that's available on your website, which is called "What Do You Need to Know to Learn a Foreign Language?" And I think that anybody who wants to actually learn a language definitely needs to read that PDF because it's incredible. And there's one thing, because the next part of the 4 strands is about language-focused learning, and this was really interesting to me. You said, typically people think of the learning of grammar as involving the learning of names of parts of speech, learning to describe grammatical constructions, and learning how to correct errors. However, these are all ways of doing deliberate learning, and most of the learning of grammar needs to involve using the language.
The research on vocabulary shows clearly that if you do deliberate study, it creates both what's called implicit knowledge and explicit knowledge. Steve's Krashen argument was that all deliberate learning only results in explicit knowledge. But research by one of our PhD students, Irina Elgort, showed that deliberate learning of vocabulary resulted in both explicit knowledge which you can retrieve from your brain and talk about and you're consciously aware of and so on, but it also created implicit knowledge. And but I don't think the same is true for grammar, and that's one of the issues that really needs more research in the learning of grammar. I think that the explicit study of grammar results in explicit knowledge. And I think the people who focus on grammar learning, like Rod Ellis and others, I think they agree with that. They argue that language use is required to develop implicit knowledge of grammatical features. And implicit knowledge means the knowledge you use without having to consciously retrieve it. So when you speak, you don't think, you know, how do I construct this sentence or so on. You make your sentence and so on, and analyze the grammar. So I think it's even more important for grammar that, you know, there's large amounts of opportunity for use.
And then the fourth strand is about practice. It's about fluency development. So again, could you sort of summarize this strand as just kind of more usage?
It's more usage, but with no new language feature learning. that's a bit of a it's a bit of a cop out in a way, because there is language feature learning in the sense that you strengthen your knowledge of known language features and you enrich your knowledge of known language features. But it means that that a good fluency development program doesn't involve unknown vocabulary and doesn't involve unknown grammar, and probably involves largely familiar content. And it's just getting good at using what you already know. One of my favorite stories for that is when I first taught in Japan. I went and I taught a couple of weekend courses. And in the week between the 2 weekend courses, we traveled around looking at beautiful places like Kyoto and so on. And the time came for us to travel from Kyoto to Osaka to teach the second weekend course. So we got on a train, but I knew hardly any Japanese. And so, wasn't sure if I was on the right train. And so I just looked around, and there was a young studious looking woman, sitting there wearing glasses and everything. So, she'll speak English. So I said, "Is this the train to Osaka?" And she looked at me and went, buried her face in her hands. And I thought, what the hell have I done here? Because, I've read about Japanese people, once they lose face, they commit harakiri, and, you never know what you're going to be responsible for. And anyway, a man's voice from the front of the train said, "Yes, Osaka." So that's all right. So we went along. Anyway, so she's sitting in the row, just, the same row as us, but with the aisle between us, So I happened to and she picks a book out of her bag and starts reading the book. Well, I accidentally dropped my pen and I bend down to pick it up and look and see what's the name of the book she's reading. And the book's in English, and it's called The Macroeconomics of Agriculture. And I thought, what the hell's going on here? Because here's a book called The Macroeconomics of Agriculture. I can't read that book. That I'd be struggling, and yet she's sitting there. She's not flipping away to look at a dictionary or anything like that, but she can't cope with the sentence, "Is this the train to Osaka?" Anyway, we get to Osaka, get off the train, and she comes up to us and says, "Where are you going?" Now, I guarantee she's been practicing that sentence for the last 15 minutes, before the train gets in. And anyway, so we tell her what suburb we're heading to, and she says, "Follow me." And so we follow her, and we managed then to strike up a kind of conversation. And it turns out that she's a master's level student studying economics through the medium of English in a Japanese university, and so on like that, and so on. But it seemed to me here was quite a good example of someone very knowledgeable about English, but with very low degree of spoken fluency. And you could see how if she had a course where she concentrated not on learning new vocabulary or things like that, but just said, let's take what you know and get that really good use and work that up to a level and where if someone says, you can respond straight away, And that's why fluency is a very important part of a course, because you can know a lot, but not be able to use it. And so fluency needs to be across each one of the 4 skills of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And the results from fluency courses are particularly reading fluency, are quite striking. You get learners doing a reading fluency course at the right level for them, which means well below their current vocabulary level. And by spending about between 7 and 10 minutes in 20 different times, you can double the reading speed of some learners and increase most of their reading speed by 50%. Now that seems too good to be true, but time after time after time of doing speed reading courses shows that this is what happens. And so the payoff for focusing on fluency is very high, and it's a very important part of a course.
That is really fascinating, and I wonder if a lot of students need to kind of stop with the obsession of moving to the next level and just, yeah, focusing on improving the skills that they already have.
Yeah, well, that's right. So I think there's a lot of knowledge there which is not usable. And the idea is making the best use of what you already know.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some vocabulary learning techniques, because I was actually speaking to David Crystal recently, and he said to me that, grammar is something that you can kind of, it has this finite kind of, there's finite things to learn, but vocabulary just seems like this impossible, Mount Everest of learning. And he asked me, do you know any, good techniques for vocabulary learning in the classroom? And I said, well, it's kind of a bit like, no, not really. It's more just about like reading, and he really wasn't impressed with with my answer. And so I'm wondering, about if you could maybe talk a little bit about some kind of specific techniques, like maybe flashcards and spaced repetition and things like that.
The most important selection principle for vocabulary is the principle of frequency. And that is, you should be learning high frequency words before low frequency words. After you've learnt the high frequency words, unless you have special purposes, you should be going on to what's now called the mid frequency words. And we now have very well researched, carefully constructed word lists showing the rough order in which students should deal with vocabulary. And that rough order makes sure that they get the best return for their learning. And this is coming back to that first job of the teacher of planning, making sure that, they're not learning this rather useless topic-related vocabulary which differs from one topic to another, but they're really consolidating this vocabulary which is useful across a wide range of topics and uses and so on like that. So that's one thing. The second thing about techniques for learning vocabulary, well, this is where I think the four strands this is one of the more profound parts of the four strands. If you ask, how do you learn vocabulary? How do you learn grammar? How do you learn to read? How do you learn to write? How do you learn pronunciation? The answer simply is the four strands. So if you want to learn vocabulary, you have to say, okay, how do I learn vocabulary through meaning-focused input? Okay, so that means that if I want to learn vocabulary, I better start doing a lot of extensive reading and extensive listening. Okay, how do I learn vocabulary through meaning-focused output? Okay, now I've got to find ways of turning my reading and listening into spoken and written production. Because if you can connect the content of your input and output strands, you increase the opportunities for repetition enormously. And repetition, there are only really two things that matter in learning vocabulary, if you want to get really simplistic. And the first thing is repetition, and the second thing is the quality of mental processing of the words that you want to learn. And they're the two things that you've got to really deal with. And then the third learning vocabulary is, well, how do I deliberately learn it myself? What should I do to deliberately learn vocabulary? And the research is very clear on this. The answer is use flashcard programs or word cards. Put the translation from L1 on the back and the word you want to learn on the front, and don't make your word cards too elaborate. Use phrases if you want to use phrases as well as words and so on, but then do spaced retrieval, not massed retrieval, do spaced retrieval. That is, work on your word cards for 10 minutes now, put them away, come back a few hours later, have another go, come back tomorrow, have another go, and then keep changing the order of the word cards and all sorts of things like that. So, but the spaced retrieval thing for deliberate learning is it's probably the most robust learning principle that we know of. And there's the research on this is it's an enormous body of research. It's not just about learning vocabulary, it's about learning, memorizing anything really. that's where training learners is really important, because you can do deliberate learning badly, or you can do deliberate learning well. And to do deliberate learning badly, make a vocab notebook, write the word in the notebook and its meaning next to it so you don't have to do retrieval. That's bad learning. Whereas if you use a flashcard program on your cell phone, something like I Know or something, a program like that, where you put the word in and the meaning, and then you can see the word, then you have to retrieve the meaning, and you can go from meaning to the word as well, that sort of stuff. These are very efficient. If we look at quality of mental processing, the shallowest type of mental processing is simply paying attention to it. And that's called noticing. So you look at the word, and looking up a word in the dictionary is an example of noticing. You just look at the word, you look at its meaning, and say, okay, good. Now, if you want to go deeper, then what you should do is you should, put your word onto a word card and then start doing retrieval, where you look at the word and say, what the hell did I write on the back of the word card, and you're then trying to retrieve that meaning. Now, if you want to move to a deeper level, then a deeper level is what I now call varied meetings and varied use. And that is, you come across the word, or you do retrieval, but you do retrieval under different circumstances or with different contexts and so on. And the reason why extensive reading is good for vocabulary learning is because extensive reading provides many, many opportunities for varied meetings with words. So that means you meet a word in a graded reader, and you might have to look it up and so on. And the next time you see it in a graded reader, it will be in a different context. I'm not making that up. We've done concordances of words in graded readers and in books, and almost invariably the word occurs in a different kind of context. And then you have to do retrieval again, but this time there are different context clues, and there might be a different adjective with the noun or whatever like that. And that variedness really deepens the quality of mental processing. And the deepest level is the level where you actually elaborate on the words you're learning. So you do word part analysis, or you use something like the keyword technique, which is a special kind of mnemonic technique for remembering the meanings of words and so on. And so, or you do things like Frank Boas and his colleagues research things like where they look at what does the sound or the shape of this word give you any indication of what the word might mean, and trying to use some kind of elaborated mental connection to make that word stick in your memory. Now, it doesn't mean that we should always be processing at the deepest level, but it means that we should be trying to make use of retrieval, we should be trying to make use of varied use, and we should be trying to make use of elaboration wherever we can.
I think that one great thing that you talk about in your PDF and in your work in general is that, you're honest about the fact that learning a language is really hard. You're not going to learn a language in 30 days or whatever. And I'm wondering, since it's so difficult, how can learners, since it's so difficult and you need motivation, right? You need to have motivation to keep going. How can learners do things like flashcards and lots of reading? How can they do those things which could be really boring, right, if they're not actually meaningful to them? How can they kind of marry things that they're personally interested to with vocabulary that's going to be useful?
Well, this is part of the teacher's job too. I mean, when you read your first book in English from the beginning to the end and understand most of it, that's very motivating. I've been struggling to learn how to read Thai. And when I got to the end of my first book, I felt a real achievement. I thought, boy, I've done that, and that thing. So that learners will feel that themselves, but this also needs to be marked. And one of the ways in which testing can help or record keeping can help is for learners to see that they are actually making progress and that there are signs of them making progress. And so with extensive reading, the number of books read, the time taken, your reading speed and all of that, these things increase as you do these activities. And teachers should be always drawing attention to those and making sure that the learners keep that motivation. But language learning is a long job. There's no doubt about it. I mean, native speakers of English have a vocabulary of around about 18, 20,000 or so words. And there's no way you're going to pick that up in a year or 6 months or so on. And so you just have to see that if you want to get really good at using a language, it's a long-term job.
Well, just one final question based on like 50 years of research and your passion for language learning. What is the kind of central thing that you really want any of the teachers and students who are watching this? What is the one thing you want them to take away from your work?
I would guess that I think I'd go back to what I said originally about training learners to take control of their own learning. I think that teachers are probably very conscientious people who work hard, but they have to realize that their working hard can be counterproductive. My teacher used to sort of amaze some of his classes by saying the best teacher is a lazy teacher. But there was always a truth underlying that, because if the teacher is working hard, that means that the wrong person in the classroom is working hard. The learners should be working hard. The teacher knows the language. Why is the teacher working hard? And so the teacher really should be making sure that the learning is being done by the learners and that they're working away at it. So I think this idea of informing learners, of showing them the range of options that they need to do to learn a language, that deliberate learning is only a part of it, an important part, but only a part, and that there is a balance of things to learn. I think getting this knowledge across is really important.
Well, Mr. Paul Nation, thank you very much for your time, sir.
No, you're very welcome. Okay, good luck.